Hi guys, Sean here from digiDirect. Now today we're going to be checking out the Sony a6500, which is Sony's newest top-of-the-range mirrorless APS-C sized camera. Now the a6500 comes in just above the a6300, which itself was just released earlier this year. Now in the same way that the a6300 was similar to the a6000 with some key improvements, the a6500 is similar to the a6300, but with again some key improvements on top. Notably on the a6500, we're looking at 5-axis in-body image stabilization, the inclusion of touchscreen capabilities, and a new high-speed processor. But before we get into all of that, let's take a quick look, as always, at the physical design of the body. Now the a6000, a6300, and a6500 now all have basically the same body design. While the a6000 has kind of a plasticky build, the a6500 now has a magnesium alloy build similar to the a6300. It's a small camera, but it feels very solid in the hand. It's got definitely a nice weight to it, a good professional feel. We've got the standard range of buttons and dials here, some control dials at the top and in the back, and a series of buttons across the body. One difference on the a6500 is that there is one extra customizable button in addition to what was on the a6300, so a slight improvement there. In the top left here, we have a nice, large, bright viewfinder. This is definitely a design highlight of this range of cameras. The viewfinder is very high resolution, very sharp, very easy to use, a really, really nice viewfinder on it. We've also got a tilting LCD screen which can tilt upwards and downwards to allow some additional mobility and movement when you're filming. It's also useful for video especially. We've got a pop-up flash at the front here in addition to a hot shoe mount, so we can put external flashes on as well. We've got a range of ports on the side here, and lastly at the front here we've got the all-important sensor, which is a 24.2 megapixel APS-C size sensor. So the first thing I want to touch on here real quick is just the autofocus capabilities of the a6500, because autofocus has been a major selling point of the entire A6 whatever range of cameras for the last little while, starting with the a6000, which even though it's a couple years old now, still has a very capable autofocus system. They updated that quite a bit with the a6300 earlier this year, and that same focusing system from the a6300 makes its way into the a6500. So that means the a6500 has 425 phase detect autofocus points, so both a huge number of autofocus points and the fact that they're phase detect means that they're very fast and accurate. In particular, the a6500 is very good at focusing on moving subjects, so any kind of sports, action, wildlife, even if you've got kids running around, it's going to do very, very well with those kind of subjects, but in general it's a very effective focusing system. So no, there's not any particularly any updates to the focusing system compared to the a6300, but it's still a very absolute top-of-the-line focusing system that is in the a6500 now. If you want a bit more information on that focusing system, you can watch my a6300 review here, but suffice to say the system on this camera here now is very, very effective. Okay, but let's start talking about some of the features that are new on the a6500 now, and the first one of these is the 5-axis in-body image stabilization system. Now this is a big deal. This is something that has been a major selling point for Sony's A7 lineup of cameras. They're full-frame mirrorless cameras, so the A7S Mark II, A7R Mark II, A7 Mark II, and so on. A lot of people were hoping that stabilization would make its way on the a6300. Unfortunately it didn't, but it is now on the a6500. So that means that any lens that you put on here, whether or not the lens has stabilization in the lens, you've got in-body stabilization in the camera. So this is going to remove the kind of the micro jitters and handshake that you'll have when holding a camera handheld. For photos, this means that you can shoot with a lot slower shutter speeds, which means you can shoot in lower light situations. And for video, this means that it'll remove a lot of that kind of handheld shake from doing handheld video. So you'll have a lot more smooth, natural-looking actions when you're doing handheld video. And the stabilization is very effective. Sony obviously has experience with these in-body image stabilization systems from their A7 lineups, and they've implemented it very well here in the a6500. It's very effective. Now, it's an important feature to be in the a6500 now because it's starting to become a staple for mirrorless cameras. You know, Olympus has had in-body image stabilization for a long time. Panasonic has started putting it into their recent cameras. Obviously, Sony already has it on their higher-end cameras. So to have it on the a6500, to have an APS-C size sensor that has that is really important. So I'm glad to see it on the a6500 here for sure. The next area of improvement on the a6500 is the addition of touchscreen capability. So finally, we can use one of the A6 whatever series cameras and use touchscreen on it. Obviously, we can use it to swipe between photos on playback, double tap to zoom in on them. But the area where it adds the most functionality is in touch focus. So finally, we can look at the back of the screen on the LCD screen and tap where we want to focus. This synergizes really well with the fact that it has that really good autofocus system, and it works really well being able just to do some tap focus options here. It also works with video, so you can tap focus in video to rack focus between two different subjects, which looks really nice. I'll touch on that a little bit more once we start talking about video in a minute here. And lastly, you also can have the camera up to your eye and use your thumb on the LCD screen to adjust focus as you're using the viewfinder as well, which is nice. We also have an upgraded processor in the a6500. So this is the same processor that's also in the new Sony a99 Mark II. So this is going to make the operation of the camera in general be faster. It'll let you review your images faster after you shoot them, and it's also going to greatly increase the buffer size on the a6500. So the a6500 can now shoot up to 233 JPEGs continuously, or 107 RAW photos. In comparison, the a6300 can shoot 44 JPEGs or 21 RAW photos continuously. So that's a huge upgrade in buffer size. It's about a 5 times upgrade we're talking about here. Now that also ties in with the fact that the a6500 can shoot up to 11 frames per second, so quite a high burst shooting speed. And both of those tie into the fact that just that autofocus system there is just so good, especially for moving subjects. The autofocus is going to track it effectively, you're going to have a high frame rate, and you're going to be able to shoot for a long sequence because of that large buffer. So a lot of synergies here that make it really, really effective for shooting those high-speed sequences on the a6500. Now, in terms of video features, the a6500 is also quite capable. It's very similar to the a6300 in this regard. It can shoot 4K video. What it actually does is shoot 6K. It's a full sensor readout, and then downscales it to 4K. Now, arguably, this gives you a bit more detail, because when you're shooting something at a high resolution and downscaling it, you capture a bit more detail than if you were just shooting it natively at 4K. So that's very nice to have in here. Really, really nice, clear, crisp video quality. When shooting at 1080p, so full HD, you can shoot it up to 120 frames per second, which is quite a high frame rate. Generally, your standard kind of slow motion is about 60 frames per second. So the higher that frame rate goes, the slower you can shoot. So 120 frames per second is quite good for really nice, slow motion. They also have an S-Log picture profile in here, which is a flat, low contrast, low saturation picture profile, which is good for color grading, and a clean output on the Hdmi port, which means you can easily use it with an external recorder like an Atomos unit or something similar. Now, earlier I touched on how that touchscreen capability allows us to do touch focus racks between point to point. This is really nice if you wanted, do a hands-off approach and you'd be able to get just a nice, smooth focus rack between 2 points just by using the touchscreen. That's easily achievable on here. You can also adjust the speed of that focus change, making it faster or slower to your preference. Now, a new feature on the a6500 allows you to shoot at as slow a frame rate as 1 frame per second. This is kind of the reverse of slow motion. This lets you get some kind of high speed, some sped up footage basically, because if you're shooting 1 frame per second, you're gonna have to shoot for 24 or 30 seconds, depending on what frame rate you wanna use, to get 1 second of video, which will give you kind of a high speed, sped up kind of look, which is interesting. Now, there is an external mic jack on the camera, so you can plug in an external mic, but unfortunately there is still no headphone jack, which is a little bit disappointing considering all the great video features on the a6500. So you won't be able to natively monitor the audio with headphones coming out of the camera. So arguably the a6500 is a very nice evolution of the a6000 lineup. It doesn't have any crazy groundbreaking features compared to the a6300, but considering the a6300 is only about 8 months old or so at this point, I wouldn't really expect it to. What it does do is bring in a couple key features that, depending on your perspective, were arguably missing from the a6300. I'm again talking about that 5-axis in-body image stabilization, touchscreen capability, and that new improved processor with a faster buffer is just a bonus to boot on top of that. So you get all the bells and whistles in here to really make this a super capable camera. And while the autofocus system is the same as from the a6300, it's still a very fast, effective focusing system. Definitely still one of the leaders of the pack, although there has been a little bit more competition in this area since the a6300 came out. But a really good autofocus system, especially for moving subjects, but just for anyone who wants to have a camera that can offer fast, effective, and reliable autofocus. Now, you can order the a6500 on our website at www.digidirect.com.au, or of course you can come to one of our stores. We have stores in the Sydney CBD, Bondi Junction, Miranda, Chatswood, the Melbourne and Brisbane CBDs, and a new store in Cannington, Western Australia, which is just outside of Perth. Thanks guys, take care.